My name is Jim Kratzis. I'm the Deputy Director over at Gerald Ford Museum, and it's my privilege to be standing in for tonight our director, Elaine Didier, who unfortunately is not able to be here tonight, nor is Joe Calvaruso, the Executive Director of the Gerald Ford Presidential Foundation, able to be here. But I am very privileged to be here representing both the museum and the Ford Library, as well as the Gerald Ford Presidential Foundation. We have those two institutions and the Hauenstein Center have always been working in a partnership over these past many years, and certainly since Gleaves has come aboard. How many years now, Gleaves?
That's been 10 years. 10
years. For 10 years, it's been a wonderful relationship, and we couldn't be more proud. And and certainly, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the namesake for the Hauenstein Center, Ralph, tonight. In January 1961, America inaugurated its first president to be born in the 20th century. It was a new age with new hopes and new horizons. Yet for the last 50 years, the 35th president of the United States is remembered more for a tragic day in Dallas, Texas, than for an administration that dealt with an increasingly tense Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, and an escalation of hostilities in Southeast Asia. These same issues are the defining images we have of the 1960s, whether it was a ruthless crushing of Czech protesters by the Soviet Union, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, or the continuous and graphic television videos of the Vietnam War brought into every American's living room every evening. Tonight, we will be enlightened by a scholar of John F. Kennedy, Professor Jason Duncan of Aquinas College, whose new book, John F. Kennedy, The Spirit of Cold War Liberalism, was released just last month. And it's on sale.
Yes, stereo.
Jason earned his doctorate in history from the University of Iowa in 1999, after a master's degree from Georgetown and a BA from St. Lawrence University in New York. He has been extensively published, including his last book, Citizens or Papists: The Politics of Anti-Catholicism in New York. Jason has been with Aquinas since 2002, now serves as chair of the history department since 2008, and I'm proud to say my daughter had him for a professor. But tonight, Jason and Gleaves will, the executive director of the Hauenstein Center, will have a little fireside chat, as you will. So without much further ado, Gleaves.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the great introduction. Jason, thanks for being here this evening. We're really excited. First of all, congratulations for publishing a fine book.
Thank you very much.
That's really hard to do. I mean, there are so many books out there, but to do a good scholarly treatment that's readable of Kennedy is most unusual, and I think that Jason's done a great job with that. So I have a number of questions that I'd like to ask to get the conversation going, and then we would like to invite you to ask questions. Those of you who are more inclined to be conservative can go over to the right wing of the auditorium.
Right.
Those of you who are more liberal and progressive can line up over here. What we hope to do is get a good conversation going about this very consequential president, his impact both politically and even culturally. Jason's book's a great launching point. Jason, I'd like to start by asking you, why the passion for John F. Kennedy?
Well, where I grew up in New York State, in Albany, New York, an Irish Catholic city largely, and Kennedy was just this huge hero. I mean, I was born in January 63. He was killed 10 months later, but like the Kennedy legacy, the Kennedy family, the Kennedy politics was so sort of infused in our community. It was a given you were pro-Kennedy. I mean, it was like my parents were like, enthusiastic for him in 60. It wasn't just, they got to go vote for somebody or we have to pick a lesser of two evils. They were enthusiastic. And I'd also say thanks to you for this invitation, Mr. Hauenstein for your support, the Ford Museum, and Jim Francis, of course. So I grew up, interested in politics and interested in the presidency, and JFK would just seem to loom over all of it. And my mother's name is Kennedy, no relation, unfortunately, or fortunately. We're not in the will, I know that.
He should have lied about it.
Yeah, it's extra, yeah. So the K in JFK Duncan is Kennedy, and I don't know if I should highlight that or hide that or just put the K in or leave the K out or put Kennedy. So I just went with the K, and people are interested and can figure it out. They're from County Wexford in Ireland, New Ross. And my mother's family is from a little place in County Waterford, Clashmore, where my wife and I have been. One county apart. So, where I grew up, as I said, it was just the interest in the Kennedys. Bobby Kennedy, my father got to meet him in the late 60s, and just the tragedy of it. It's a very American story, it's a very Irish story. These two great young politicians killed at the height of their careers. And I guess I've gone through life. I've always read about Kennedy, thought about him, but I've always done it as kind of a sidelight. When I can read my books, learn about my history, and I'm done with that, I pick up the books on Kennedy as something I just wanted to do. I've always was sort of a hobby. I get a chance to write a biography. I met this editor at an early American conference. We meet, he says, well, what do you write about Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson? This makes sense because we met at an early American conference. So I thought, I was seized with the idea. I just said, JFK. What about John F. Kennedy? And he said, no, no JFK. He's been done, and we want to make it more broad than that. And so finally I said, he's from New York, so I can be blunt with my fellow New Yorker, this guy. So I said, JFK, his name was Paul Finkelman. It's JFK or nobody. That was a risk for someone who really didn't have a lot to stand on, right? I mean, he could have said bye-bye, and there's the door, and have a nice life. But I think he saw my commitment to it. So we said, okay, JFK. So I started writing the book when we were in Ireland 2 years ago. And one of the things I learned very quickly, you cannot separate John F. Kennedy from his family. If he wanted to, it would be an incomplete book. Now, we often think of presidents as sort of lone wolves, right? They're sort of separate from their families. And we don't really think of the Reagans. And the Bushes are an exception, of course. So are the Adamses. But with the Kennedys, there's a reason it's the plural. His father, his brothers. And one of the things I picked up in investigating his life is he was part of a family enterprise that was focused on one point. I was thinking about this today. I was walking across the campus in Aquinas. I've worked for politicians before, and one of the things they really struggle with good reason, is trying to find people they can trust and depend on. Their aides. Can they trust these people? Are these guys or women in it for me, or in it for that coveted wing in the office in the West Wing? Or are they in it for their own fame? Can I really trust them? And that's a good question. And sometimes they really can't. But John F. Kennedy could. He had his father, his brother Bobby. Bobby was willing to be his bad cop. Bobby once said, when he dealt with other politicians, I don't care if they hate me forever, as long as they help elect my brother president of the United States. And that's a rare thing in politics, because usually, campaign people go from campaign to campaign, and yes, they believe in the candidate, of course, I assume they do, but there isn't that closer connection that JFK had with his brother and his sisters and his mother. They were extremely effective as a group. In the 1960 primary in Wisconsin, Hubert Humphrey said, I feel like I'm running a dime store against a chain operation here, using phrases that are no longer with us. Every time I turn around, I get a report that a Kennedy was somewhere in Wisconsin. They all look like Jack and sound like Jack. I don't know who's who, but I just know they're everywhere. And so it wasn't just Bobby, it was Joe, it was Teddy, it was Eunice, who was a very formidable figure. John F. Kennedy went in 1959 to Iowa as part of his run-up to the presidency. And among other things, he went to Iowa City to watch Notre Dame play Iowa in football. So a reporter tried to trick him into the question. He said, who are you rooting for, Senator Kennedy, Notre Dame or Iowa? And that puts him in a tough spot. And I think he might have borrowed this from Al Smith, but he said, I'll be rooting for Iowa, but praying for Notre Dame. So he just nailed that, So, and after that, he went out to a small town in Iowa where my mother happens to be from. Or it was near where she was from, Carroll County, named for the Kennedys of the 18th century, the Carrolls, very prominent Catholic family in Maryland. Well, he's out there because it's a Catholic county, it's a Democratic county, it's one of the few rural Democratic counties in Iowa, and one of only 6 counties and one in that state against Nixon. But he's trying to get votes for the Iowa delegation to the convention. Nikita Khrushchev had been 10 miles away in Coon Rapids just a few months before. When I was in grad school at Georgetown, in my master's in Russian studies, and my uncle is an Iowa farmer who has barely ever been out of Iowa. He's a real farmer and a great man, a good guy. And I was telling him about grad school at Georgetown and had been in Russia a few years before, and I'm trying to speak Russian. And he said very quietly, well, let me tell you about the time I met Khrushchev. So he started putting me in my place. Whether he intended to or not, he did. And when JFK was in Carroll, my uncle met him, my grandfather met him, and the first thing JFK said is, my mother sends regards. Because she had been in this little town like 6 months before. So running against the Kennedys was just that, running against the Kennedys. And many other presidents have risen without the help of their families. Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter to a certain degree, Gerald Ford perhaps too. But that gave him a big advantage. People who he could depend on, who would do anything for him, who were highly skilled at politics. And it wasn't just the family. It was his Boston roots. His family had deep roots in that city's politics and history. So, he meets in 1946, he's running for Congress. And he's told in this certain part of his district, the man I talked to was Dave Powers of Charleston. It was a modest home in an Irish American neighborhood. So, 28-year-old Jack Kennedy goes to meet him and says, I've heard you're pretty good at this area in politics. I'd like to have you help me. So Powers says, you look like an appealing young guy, but I'm for the guy down the street who I'm friends with for a long time, and he got to me first, and I'm for him. So, Kennedy didn't become president by taking no for an answer. He says, well, I understand that, but could you do me one favor? Always got to be skeptical of a politician or a mobster saying, could you do me just one favor, right? Boston sometimes do the same thing, the same people. But anyway, he goes, I guess. He goes, will you come with me to this meeting with this group of veterans of the foreign war? So he goes, I guess I can, but I'm telling you, buddy, I'm not for you, I'm for this other guy. So they go to this meeting of mothers who've lost their sons in the war. And he gets up there and talks about his brother and his mother being a Gold Star mother. And after he's done, these women just rush the stage. And Dave Powers is like, I don't know what this guy has got. I mean, he's not particularly well-spoken. He's kind of shy. He looks like a teenager. He looks unhealthy. But he's got something. And I'm for him now, and he was with him until Dallas. So Kennedy had the Irish Mafia, is what I'm trying to say. And these guys were devoted to him, for better or for worse. Even today, there's not much sort of, guess what? I knew the real JFK, and here's the book about it. There really isn't much of that. You would think there might be after all these years, but there's a certain loyalty to him that continues. And again, it can be critiqued as a too much loyalty, maybe, but I really think that was one of the keys to his political success. His family and then other people he could draw around him, not just the Irish people in Boston, certainly people like Sorensen and Arthur Schlesinger and others, who really developed this great loyalty to him. I think Abraham Lincoln has something like that, another president who made it without a family per se, or his original family. So that was a long answer to your very good question.
He's a professor.
Yes, occupational hazard. There's a couple of them in the back. I know what I mean. It's Anyway, go ahead, please.
We speak in 55-minute blocks.
Yeah,
so
right.
You're going to be here a while.
Or 75. It depends on the school. Yeah.
No, very good start. A lot of good provocative points that you put out there. And I guess I want to ask you now with a follow-up question. How many books have there been written about JFK?
I read somewhere 40,000 or something. 40,001, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. 40,001.
There's a lot.
And that leads to my follow-up question, which, with all of those books out there, what is the new angle or the new insight or something that you learned personally in the course of writing this book that was really surprising to you?
Well, the first books were the myth books. Well, Sorensen, Schlesinger, JFK was almost too good to be true. He was perfect, he was perfect in all ways. Nobody's that perfect, as we found out. So then there's a sort of a counter-revisionism. He was an adulterer, ineffective, a warmonger, weak on civil rights, and that prevailed in the 70s and 80s, largely, in part. There's always pro-Kennedy books, but that was part of it. Maybe the last 10 years or so, I think there's a new recognition of his achievements at home, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Bill, the space race, the Peace Corps. And I think the massive amount of coverage, and I was really afraid it'd be just the four of us, Amy and me and you and Annette maybe tonight, because there was so much JFK stuff the last few weeks, I was afraid you'd be scared off by it or tired of it. But there was a real outpouring. I mean, when I talk to people who lived through the Kennedy presidency and remember that day or maybe met him, like in his trip to Michigan in '60, their idealism was real. It was real. I mean, ask not what you can do, ask what you can do for your country, and appealing to people's better instincts. The Peace Corps, which he announced at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, at 3 in the morning after a long day of campaigning. We brought our son to the pediatrician last year, just the day I was writing about the Peace Corps section in the book. So I mentioned to our doctor, who's from Ghana, I said, some of the Kennedy's first Peace Corps volunteers went to Ghana. She said, I know. We had 2 of them in my high school growing up. And now she's a pediatrician doing great work here in Grand Rapids. So he was flawed. I mean, he was comfortable with deception, unfortunately. His health, his marriage, he didn't put it all out there. Few politicians do. But I think 50 years later, I think there's a growing recognition among most historians that it was a loss that day. It was a shock, obviously. In some ways, we're still sort of dealing with it, I think, as a nation, because it was so stunning. The Boston Globe the next day, his hometown newspaper, more or less, it didn't even really say facts. It didn't say Kennedy killed in Dallas. It said shock, grief, disbelief. It was emotions, a sputtering. That's very rare in a modern newspaper. So, I can't recapture that moment because I was 10 months old in a stroller. But at Hal's drugstore in Albany, when Mother heard the news. But just hearing the reactions of people, it was a trauma. It was a real trauma for the nation. As we've learned about Kennedy since, we've got a fuller picture, a more complicated picture, a more interesting picture, I think. But as one historian said recently on TV, and there was a lot of them on TV, so I can't remember which exactly one said this, but he said, Americans seem to have largely forgiven him his transgressions. And there are transgressions to be forgiven. I mean, there are problems. I mean, he was not faithful to his wife. There's no defending that. Why exactly, I'm not sure. I don't know. It's a question maybe only, I don't know who can answer. Maybe Mrs. Kennedy is now deceased too. And he made his mistakes as president. And as a president, the Bay of Pigs was a mistake. The hesitancy on civil rights the first couple of years. As we were talking about, Steve Ayers and I, before the event, his best state in 1960 was Little Rhode Island. Heavily Catholic, Massachusetts neighbor, Little quirky Rhode Island, 63%. The second best state wasn't Massachusetts or New York or Connecticut. It was Georgia, with a virtually all-white Democratic electorate. And we forget that, because from this perspective, the South is Republican, and New England, of course, is Democratic. Kennedy loses 3 New England states. He loses Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. But he wins South Carolina, and he wins Georgia, because that Civil War legacy was still strong in the South. And he knew that. He's a good politician. He knows how to count votes. He knows who voted for him and who didn't. So he's a little skittish, with some good reason. There was also a segregationist challenge that year that's often forgotten. Think about Thurman in 48 against Truman, the Dixiecrats. And Wallace in 68 versus Humphrey and Nixon. But in 60, Harry F. Byrd of Virginia, rural Virginia, ran on a segregationist ticket against Kennedy and Nixon, and he got, I think, 16 electoral votes. He won all of Mississippi's, some of Alabama's, and I think one in Oklahoma. So he's very, that was the world that Kennedy was running in. So the first couple of years, he was very careful not to go too far. He doesn't run for office in 46, for the House, or 52 for the Senate. These are before Brown versus Board of Education. Most politicians in the 50s didn't know what to make of the civil rights movement in both parties. Stevenson, Eisenhower. Nixon was better than most. But even Hubert Humphrey, a little bit, you don't want to go out too far, especially if you're a Democrat, because then you lose the South. And then what? If you're losing half of New England, you have to keep the South close at hand. So he was overly cautious, I think. He was a little bit timid. He didn't want pictures taken of Sammy Davis Jr. at a White House reception with his white girlfriend. He didn't want that to get in the paper. He didn't want to be known. He didn't want to get too out front of the nation on that. Few presidents would. Most white Americans were like, especially outside the South, I think they were really grappling toward understanding what was called at the time the Negro Revolution. I think a lot of people were sympathetic toward it, but not fully behind it, maybe. By 63, when Dr. King takes his people to Birmingham, it's a disaster. There's people beaten, little girls attacked by police dogs. The news goes all across America in newspapers, and pictures are, in the 20th century, are vivid, of course. They're an important part of communication. Kennedy tells an aide, the pictures make me sick to my stomach. Now, before that, I think he had been a little bit, I don't think he quite understood viscerally the civil rights movement. One time he said to an aide, I wish this, pardon the language, but this is what he said, this goddamn civil rights mess would just go away. That would have been easier for him as a president, but it wasn't going away. So not only did the pictures go across America, they go across the world. How did they get across the world? The Soviet Union. Make sure every leader in every nation in Africa and Asia sees them. They say, with some good reason, this is the true face of American democracy. They talk about equality. They talk about all men are created equal. They throw it in our face everywhere they go. But look at the reality on the ground in Alabama and other places. If you're black in America, and of course they put in Marxist terms, racism is a product of capitalism somehow, this is a result. This is the true face of America. And Kennedy was very aware of the third world. That's one of the things I learned in reading this book. He really put a lot of effort and initiative into it that I didn't quite realize before. He went to South America. He spent a lot of time working with leaders in those countries. He was on good personal terms with African leaders as well, because he knew these were newly independent nations. And they were up for grabs. As he said in his inaugural address, we should help the nations of the third world. Not because we want their votes, not because the communists are doing it, but because it is right. But he also wanted their votes. And he also knew the communists were doing it. So when the KGB made it very clear that this was, that this is what they thought, they used this for their own purposes, that drives Kennedy. So when I call the book The Spirit of Cold War Liberalism, that I think there's a connection between his Cold War view and his liberal political, especially domestic. There's a connection. Also, 1960, he goes to West Virginia. an important primary state. He first goes in there after winning Wisconsin. He thinks he's got Humphrey knocked out. Humphrey doesn't compete in New Hampshire, Kennedy's neighboring state. He figures Kennedy's got that. But Kennedy goes out to Humphrey's neighboring state, Wisconsin. He was so popular in western Wisconsin, he was called the third senator from Wisconsin. Minnesota is a neighboring state. He beats Humphrey there. Then a couple weird things start to happen. There's talk, well, Kennedy, and this was the news media, Kennedy won because Catholic Republicans crossed into the Democratic primary and voted for him. Now that's hard to prove. And it may have been true, but Kennedy was a little bit frustrated. Here he wins, he thinks he's knocked out his main opponent in his neighboring state, and Humphrey announces he's going to West Virginia. Well, the Kennedy campaign's first poll, Jack's way ahead in West Virginia. Then the word gets out he's Catholic, and his support almost evaporated overnight, at least from the moment. They had a big decision to make. Do they keep going into West Virginia? If they lose, he might have been driven from the race. You start losing primaries on religion, he's got big problems. And then they thought, well, let's have a halfway measure. We won't pull out. We'll expect defeat. Run a good race. We'll lose, of course. And then we'll say, look how well we did in a mainly Protestant state. I'm sure you see the flaws in that strategy, right? He wasn't running to make a statement or moral victories, right? We only lost by these many points. So they go all out in West Virginia. They throw money around, which is the tradition in that state. They bring in Franklin Roosevelt, Jr., who's an icon, his father is, in West Virginia. They also unfairly accuse Humphrey of being a draft dodger. This was tough stuff. Humphrey roars around in West Virginia blaring the song, "Give me that old-time religion," which is a very Baptist hymn making the point, hey, this guy's not one of us. He's something else. Mm-hmm. But when Kennedy goes to West Virginia, he was stunned by the poverty. Now, he grew up in wealth. He represented working-class people in Boston and other cities as a senator, but he had never seen this abject poverty. He was stunned that in a nation this wealthy, you have people without decent housing or medical care or education. And this was part of his education as a politician. I often wonder, it's such a big, vast country, how much about the United States can our presidents really know? I mean, it's not easy to be an expert in every state and its history. And Kennedy wasn't. No president could be. But I think he saw that and he thought, we're in a competition with the Soviets. And if we have people living in these kind of conditions, and other people living in this great wealth, how does that look to the rest of the world? What does that say about our system? A few are rich, a lot are poor. So some of his anti-poverty efforts, he had read a review or read Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, published in the early 60s. He may have read a review of it in the New Yorker, but Harrington writes this very influential book about the hidden poverty in the midst of plenty in places like West Virginia, South Dakota, Indian reservations, the nation's cities. So with Kennedy, it wasn't simply, let's eliminate poverty because it's wrong, but let's reduce poverty because we want to show the world in this fierce competition, our system works for the most amount of people. That's part of his Cold War liberalism. So in his first debate with Vice President Nixon, if I can continue along these lines, I know this is a very long answer to your question.
55 minutes, folks.
Right, yeah. I think one of the myths is that, well, Nixon really won the first debate, but because he looked bad on TV, and Kennedy looked tan and relaxed, and Nixon looked kind of sweaty because his makeup ran, and he was in the hospital for 2 weeks. There's an irony in that because Nixon had been so healthy his whole life. He was only 47. As Kennedy said very deftly, my opponent is also a young man. We forget Nixon was young too, not just Kennedy. But Nixon had bagged his knee getting out of a car and had a staph infection and spent 2 weeks in a hospital. He was just out of the hospital. He was 1 week from weight loss and hospitalization. So this healthy man looked not so good. And Kennedy, who was often sick and unhealthy, through exercise and steroids and medicines and God knows what else, he never looked better. So it was a bit unfair. It was unfair, but life's unfair. But that debate, if you watch the debate and read the transcripts, Kennedy dominates it. He gets out there, and of course, he has the advantage. He's the challenger. So he can lay at Nixon's feet every shortcoming in the United States for the previous 8 years, in falling behind in housing, education, healthcare. The Soviets were clearly the first nation in space. As Kennedy said, when the Sputnik was a dog on board, a little dog who never made it back, no gravity-like heroic rescue for this little one. But as Kennedy said, the first dog in space wasn't named Fido or Checkers, a little shot at poor Nixon, but Strelka, which is the Russian word for like shot or moonshot. And so he was saying, we have to catch up, not just militarily, but at home. And Nixon, for much of that debate, and both men are really moderates, I think, in a lot of ways. And that's one of the reasons Kennedy's religion was such a big deal, because Nixon and Kennedy weren't all that different in their political view at that time. But Nixon would say things like, well, I think Senator Kennedy has a good point, but it sounds a little expensive. Or I think Senator Kennedy has the right idea here, but maybe it's not quite the time for that. So Nixon's campaign got deluged by telegrams from angry Republicans asking two questions. Why did the vice president not look very good? And why was he so much in agreeing with Kennedy? So Kennedy set the agenda. And Nixon mistakenly thought the lowest rated debate would be the first debate, and interest would build over time. And the fourth debate was the debate crescendo. And that's when he would really lower the boom on Jack, who he sort of underestimated as sort of a lightweight. Well, Nixon underestimated the patience of the American television viewer even in 1960, because the first debate was the highest rated. And the other three, which are really forgotten now, except down the memory hole of history, were less and less watched on TV, even in an era of only 3 networks. Nixon was a very good debater and a very smart, knowledgeable man. And he really did much better in the later debates. He gave as good as he got later on, and he was no slouch, to say the least. That's one of the reasons he agreed to debate Kennedy in the first place, because he had debated so successfully with Mr. Khrushchev in Moscow. But it's that first debate, and then, of course, in the 1960s, as Marshall McLuhan said, image is so essential. So I think there's a bit of a counter myth that Kennedy somehow looked better on TV, looked like a movie star, but didn't have much to say. He had a lot to say. And Nixon agreed with a lot of it. So Kennedy is really sort of setting the tone, that first debate. And as he said, I don't believe in big government. I believe in effective governmental action. Now, conservative critics would say, well, of course he says that, because big government sounds tyrannical or ominous, especially to our ears today. But this is an era after World War II, after the Great Depression. The federal government, the trust in the government was well over 50% to do the right thing. The federal government, there's a belief in it at the time that's almost inconceivable today. Today, even most Democrats don't trust the government, oddly enough. And most Republicans don't, even more Republicans don't, especially at the national level. This is pre-Watergate, pre-Vietnam, pre-intellectual and cultural revolution in the late 60s, early 70s. And so it's a different climate. And government, its ability to solve problems, reduce poverty, at that moment, it's there. And one can easily critique it, well, it was too ambitious, the war on poverty fails, the social spending doesn't really work. But in the early 60s to mid-60s, there's one story called it the liberal hour. That belief is pretty strong. And I think Richard Nixon himself, when he was president, shared in some of it based on his policies.
Very good. Well, you've touched on a lot of themes that we're interested in at the Hauenstein Center. When you start talking about debates and the definition of Cold War liberalism as much more in a context of competition with the Soviet Union, which colored the ability of Democrats and Republicans in that time to work together. Here at the Hauenstein Center, we're interested in common ground, civil discourse. How do we encourage people to find actionable common ground through principled negotiation. We're not talking about abandoning your position or becoming a squish in the middle. Please speak a little bit about JFK's ability to find common ground, why he is still such an attractive politician to both liberals and conservatives today, because we certainly heard Ronald Reagan invoke Kennedy's name, particularly on economic policy. And then when you read the inaugural address, you do see a true Cold Warrior. I mean, the overwhelming majority of the inaugural address is about fighting the Cold War, defending against the Soviet Union. Please speak to common ground.
Well, now, Kennedy's Democratic Party in Massachusetts was very different than the Massachusetts Democratic Party today. In 1948, Tip O'Neill, after the elections that year, gets elected the first Democratic Speaker of the House in the history of Massachusetts. Now, that's hard to imagine, right? Because before that had been Republican, Whig, Federalists, going way back to the Republic. Why did Democrats do so well in 48? The Catholic bishops urged their flocks to go out and vote against a statewide referendum that would have allowed physicians to discuss birth control with married women, which is against the church's teaching. So most Catholics in Massachusetts were Democrats, but there was a real conservative tinge to it at that point. And they go out and vote against the ban and against that, loosening that issue up, and then for Democrats. So he, in the early 50s, late 40s, he doesn't join the Americans for Democratic Action. He says, I'm not really comfortable with certain types of intellectual liberals. Now, eventually, he and they have an agreement, coming together in the later 50s, because he wants to become a national figure. But he's not particularly partisan. When he runs against Henry Cabot Lodge, they're both Cold Warriors, Harvard grads, World War II veterans. It really looks like a tribal, ethnic, Yankee, Protestant Republicans versus urban, ethnic, Catholic, and Jewish, and Orthodox Democrats. So he doesn't cut his teeth in a real ideological sphere. Now, when he runs for president, at times he can be pretty partisan, because he knows most people in 1960 are Democrats. Now, it's a very fractious party, Southern conservatives, Northern liberals. So he does, use the partisan advantage when he can. But as president-elect, he puts some Republicans in his cabinet. Douglas Dillon, Secretary of the Treasury. Robert McNamara, a Republican Ford executive, I think, from Michigan. Now, there's a twist to that story, too. When Kennedy, who doesn't know McNamara, has never met him, but the name sounds Irish Catholic. So Kennedy has already agreed, under his father's pressure in part, to name his 35-year-old brother Robert to be the Attorney General, an important job in the administration. So Secretary of Defense is even more important, arguably, especially in the Cold War. So Kennedy asked his aides, find out if he's Catholic or not. If he had been Catholic, he wouldn't have been nominated. But he was Protestant, Kennedy put him in. So a couple of key positions, appointments, go to Republicans in his cabinet. When it comes to the Test Ban Treaty, and Charles Brown brought this to my attention, and I'm glad he did, he sends a bipartisan delegation to Moscow to oversee ratification, or negotiation of the treaty. Woodrow Wilson doesn't bring any Republicans with him to Paris in 1919. That poisons the well at home, and ultimately leads to his beloved League of Nations being defeated in the Senate. So, Kennedy had friends who were Republicans, including President Ford, and they were congressmen. He was a part in 1962 in the midterm elections. He could sound pretty partisan at that time, but the parties were less polarized. As I said, there's moderate Republicans in New England, in the North, especially conservative Democrats in the South. So both parties had to negotiate within your party. I think that was a healthy thing. I remember my beloved advisor at St. Lawrence, who was very liberal and progressive, saying we need programmatic political parties. Nixon talked about this a little bit, Roosevelt did, a liberal party and a conservative party. I'm not convinced it's working out for the country. I think it makes a more interesting politics, a little more nuanced politics, a little more common ground politics, have people of different ideological persuasions in different parties. Now, a political scientist could easily say, but that doesn't make any sense. That's incoherent. Why should both parties have liberals and conservatives? And in large part, it's due to American history, the Civil War, and regionalism. And it's a good question. And why should we have these broad-based parties which don't have a lot in common, as opposed to today? But I still think it makes for better, less partisan and polarizing politics. And I think Kennedy at his best, I don't think he was hugely interested in partisanship. I think he once said, sometimes party loyalty asks too much.
Very good. Mm-hmm. Well, I want to change the subject here just a little bit because the whole nation has been awash in retrospectives on the 50th anniversary of the assassination. I'd like to know what your assessment is, especially in a town like Grand Rapids, where then Congressman Gerald R. Ford was the member of the Warren Commission who lived the longest, and he had one interpretation of the Warren Commission throughout his adult life. I would like to know how you assess the assassination, the Warren Commission, in American memory.
A lot of the Kennedy books are conspiracy books, obviously. And I think the conspiracy, conspiracy folks, and I'm not one, I think Oswald did it alone. I think the evidence is pretty clear on that. But I've been trying to think about what motivates the conspiracy folks. And I think at their best, they're really aggrieved by this event. Now, how could this happen in our country? How could this man be taken away in an instant with no real explanation and no real larger forces at work? So I think it's based in some ways on affection for Kennedy, the conspiracy theories. But the evidence, I think, points, especially now we have computer graphics, we can trace the path of the shots, Oswald's actions, the lead up to that day, what he did afterwards. The Warren Commission is incomplete, I think, in some ways. But in its main findings, I think it's largely correct that Oswald did it. He was a loner, disaffected communist. It's to my satisfaction, he did it. There was a PBS special recently rebroadcast last week. Who was Lee Harvey Oswald? In the PBS Frontline series, really well respected for its integrity. And the hard evidence was so clearly pointed at Oswald. Oddly enough, a couple times they kind of fainted in a direction of a conspiracy almost to give themselves more credibility or something, but they really admitted almost ruefully there's nothing there. I think Oswald did it. Now, I do think it's remotely possible there was some connection he had to somebody else or some other group, but I think it's remote. And the fact that he was killed himself 2 days later just adds to the conspiracy myth and adds to the mystery of it. And I think his assassination is a mystery, but not in the whodunit sense. I think we know who did it. But it's a mystery maybe in a larger existential or philosophical or even theological sense. The sudden death of this person who had so much power and authority, was the most famous person in the world. His administration was going well. He had his family with him that day, his wife and supporters and friends, cheering crowds. And then in a minute, it's gone. And it's really not easy to make sense of it. And I think that is sort of the mystery of it, more than who pulled the trigger, because we know who pulled the trigger, and I think we know that pretty conclusively.
I've just got to point out to the audience, and since we are having a conversation here, you and I met for the first time in October of 2003 when Robert Dallek came and spoke over at the Ford Gym. Remember that? And Dallek dwelled also on this fascinating point of the disconnect between the majesty of the presidency and a very charismatic president being taken out by somebody who's so tawdry and a lowlife.
Yeah.
And
yes.
The United States, our people, our culture has never come to terms with that. It doesn't fit sort of in the Shakespearean mold of tragedy.
It doesn't. It doesn't. And it's a real paradox. I mean, Dallas has been criticized for being hostile to Kennedy. It's overly, right-wing and conservative. And Adlai Stevenson had been assaulted physically a month before. and there was like a certain right-wing group that hated Kennedy. And that all is true. But the paradox is, Oswald was not under great surveillance because the police, the FBI, the Secret Service, they feared, with good reason, a right-wing threat to Kennedy. Dallas was not full of disaffected Marxist-Leninists who had lived in the Soviet Union. And so in that way, he fell through the cracks. Now, a brilliant detective might have thought, my God, let's think outside the box. Let's think counterintuitively. Let's think of the thing we're not thinking of. But their main job was to protect the president against threats. And the threat they saw coming from the right. Now, I saw another historian on TV recently, Larry Sabato of Virginia. And he made an interesting point, really kind of a sad point. He said, it really wasn't surprising Kennedy was killed that day. It's surprising he wasn't killed much earlier. I mean, you look at that day, as I say, as we would say today, 200,000 unscreened people lining the streets. He goes up to the crowd at the airport. These people are screening was a word not in use then. I talked to a Secret Service agent once about this, sort of off the record, and he said they didn't have a lot of people. There were 11 agents that day in Dallas, 11. And he's in the open car. There are open windows in buildings. I mean, never again. When President Obama came to Marquette, where Amy's from, a couple years ago, his motorcade is 90 miles an hour. You're not even sure which car he's in. And they cut the brush off the side of the road just in case. They're so thorough now, just in case someone wasn't hiding in the brush with a bomb or a gun. In 1963, this is a time where people get on airplanes and they ask you for your ticket when you're halfway over Cleveland, right? I mean, it's a very different world then. And you look back and you see all those happy people, and the last thing Kennedy heard was Mrs. Connally saying, Mr. President, you can't say Texas or Dallas doesn't love you. It was obvious most of the people did. At least those who were there that day. And then one person out of the blue, it's really a singular event in American history. I mean, Lincoln was killed as a result of conspiracy at the end of this horrible war, where 600,000 deaths had just preceded it. The shock that day must have just been hard to put into words, I would say.
Well, Jason, what I'd like to do now is encourage people to come forward with your questions. I'm going to ask one last question, though, while this is happening. So please come forward. What is Kennedy's legacy at this point in our history and in the American memory?
Well, it's a great question. 50 years later, I think his legacy is that problems can be solved peacefully at home. Americans can address the race issue. He said in an Northern address, let us not ever negotiate with fear, but let's not fear to negotiate. I think as he put it well about himself, he was an idealist without illusions. And I think he believed in a government, a federal government, that could do things to help build a better society here and also do good things around the world and if possible even work with our adversaries. So it's a big legacy, I think. I'm not even sure the book title, my publisher would shoot me if I said this, but I'm not sure my book title fully captures it. But I like that the word spirit came in. Originally it was called The Burdens of Cold War Liberalism because he often talked about the burdens of leadership, the responsibilities and the burdens of world leadership in the Cold War. But I think there was the spirit. That's why I picked this title. Is Jim still here? It's from Western PA, 1962. I think the optimism, the genuine commitment to building a better world, not as a utopian world, certainly not a world without differences, but using our world leadership in responsible and creative ways. And he did that at his best. The Alliance for Progress, the Peace Corps, the space race. Of course, he made his mistakes, but I do think that legacy, that best part of it will endure.
You all are a very shy audience, and the teacher and both of us, we're going to start calling on you. So come forward with your questions, please. In the meantime, I'm going to ask another question, and hopefully they'll get some gumption and come up here and challenge you a little bit.
Great. Up to a point. Great. No, go ahead. No.
Oh, okay, Jim Mitchell. Thank you, sir.
Somebody has to break the ice. Don't you think that a pretty good case can be made that even by today's standards, John F. Kennedy was what we would call a conservative, not a liberal. He gave us the biggest tax cut in the history of the Union up to that time. He was stridently anti-communist. Half of his budget went to defense. He appointed the most conservative Supreme Court justice that had been appointed in many years, in Byron White. And he said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I think he was pretty conservative.
Well, that's a really good question. He did. There's a new book out, John F. Kennedy Conservative. I'm not ready yet, but I'd like to. He did cut taxes. You're right, and he was anti-communist. And conservatives have a right to his legacy too, I think. I don't think it's one or the other. My favorite line of the campaign last year, we used to watch the Republican primaries because they're the only game in town in 2012. And Newt Gingrich, who always made for an interesting interview, even when he lost, or maybe especially when he lost. And one night he's on TV, and he has a gleam in his eye, and he's looking to stick the fit in his opponents. And he said, and Newt's very interested in space. So he said, well, let's look at the space question. He said, let's compare the courage of John F. Kennedy to the cheapness of Santorum and Romney. So, he sort of kind of tapped into that. But I think he's liberal in the sense of using the government to help alleviate poverty, to the Peace Corps, Alliance for Progress. So there is a strong governmental aspect to what he's trying to do. But he was also, at his best, pragmatic. You're right. The tax cut is certainly legitimate. I discuss it in this book. The tax rates were astronomically high after World War II, both for corporate individuals. And he proposed a pretty significant cut across the board. He wasn't an economist. He had to learn it on the fly, like a lot of politicians. But his philosophy once was, a rising tide lifts all boats. So he comes from wealth. The economic system of the United States had given him incredible opportunities and advantages. And his family, his father, was a capitalist, as he said. So he wasn't in any way a socialist, or maybe he wasn't Huey Long either, spread them well. But I did think he thought the government could do some things to create opportunity, to lessen the hard edges of capitalism, and that could include a tax cut too. So I agree that conservatives can make a claim for Kennedy. I think that's what makes him interesting in a way, that both liberals and conservatives can look to part of his legacy and say, yeah, we agree with that, we get that, we like that. And that's a good thing, I think.
I appreciated your comments on the civil rights issue because many people don't remember that when Eisenhower sent the troops into Little Rock, Kennedy criticized it very publicly.
He did. Thank you. Yep.
When you said a rising tide lifts all boats, of course, we associate that later with Jack Kemp, the tax cutter, the Republican stalwart. And, this is, again, a Republican appropriating Kennedy for his own purposes. And, a lot of common ground there.
But Landry, of course, was just Democratic.
Yes, please.
Kennedy's legacy from the Eisenhower administration was the Bay of Pigs. He was not in favor of going along with it, but didn't give it enough thought. After that, he gave plenty of thought to the missile crisis and was at that time convinced that he would never again be told what to do from the generals in charge.
Well, that's a good point too. Bay of Pigs, he basically inherits it from President Eisenhower. And the plan was in motion. Now, Eisenhower had great credibility on seaborne invasions, right? D-Day, commander of Europe. Kennedy was a junior officer. He's new to the job. He's 43 years old. I think he had some very well-founded skepticism about that operation, but he made a mistake. At his best, he would ask people hard questions. Tell me how that's going to work. And that meant he was new to the job, it's a tough job to learn, he was a little intimidated maybe, he was afraid of an backlash against being soft on communism. I wouldn't say he went against his instincts on that, because he did give it approval. But he also made it clear, we're not going in, even if it goes bad. And most of the Cuban exiles and a lot of the U.S. military thought, well, he really doesn't mean that. If it goes bad, he'll come in, he'll save the day, he has to. But he said, so that way he did stick to his position, and it was a disaster. The Auditorium said a perfect disaster. But you're right, after that, he was a little more skeptical of the generals. I think he respected them, I hope he did, but I think at his best, he was an independent thinker. He asked good questions, and he listened to the answers. And I think he learned a very tough lesson in April of '61.
Very good. Sir?
Yes. What is your opinion about the Warren Report and how it was handled? It seems like it fomented the whole idea that, hey, there's something that they're hiding.
Mm-hmm.
You got to put this away for 75 years, I think it was, or something, until, even the people who know how to spell Kennedy can't remember it.
Right. Well, I think I'm not an expert in the Warren Commission, but I think their main conclusion is held up. Now, in the late 70s, there was a second official government investigation after Vietnam, Watergate, the social and cultural changes, the House Select Committee on Assassinations. At the end of their deliberations, they were about to conclude the Warren Commission was right, after all. But then they were made aware of a fourth gunshot, supposedly. And they based their entire conclusion that there was a fourth shot. Oswald fired 3, somebody else fired a 4th. Therefore, there must have been a conspiracy. But later, more technological, in-depth experiments have proven there wasn't a 4th gunshot. And that committee's work has been discredited largely and forgotten largely. The Warren Commission, again, I'm not an expert in every aspect of it, but their main conclusion, I think, was the truth about who did it.
But the way they did it?
Excuse me?
They tried to hide the details, They were not allow anything to be published or looked at for...
Well, they did publish their own report. A lot of evidence in that. There are some documents not yet released. I think that's sort of standard operating procedure for national security. We'll see if they ever... I do agree with the conclusions, though. Okay? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
I have a question that is actually related to the Warren Commission report. CNN aired a documentary a few weeks ago in connection with the anniversary, which contended that the loss of faith in government started with the Warren Commission report and all the conspiracy theories that led to. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think it probably has more to do with Vietnam, Watergate, but even a broader sort of cultural shift, questioning authority. If the government says it, it's probably wrong. I don't think that the Warren Commission itself really... you can fold that into that general changing worldview, but I don't lay the blame for that at the feet of the Warren Commission. Part of it is who's on it. Gerald Ford. He like Kennedy. He's later. I think Gerald Ford's honesty is been proven. He's an honest man. John Sherman Cooper of Kentucky, a Republican, one of Kennedy's best friends in the Senate. Earl Warren, liberal Chief Justice of the United States. Early 60s and mid-60s, the Supreme Court, Congress, the presidency were basically on the same page for about 5 years. Why would Earl Warren participate in a cover-up of the murder of the president? I don't think there's a good answer to that question because he didn't do that. I don't know his personal relationship with Kennedy, but I assume he supported Kennedy's civil rights bill, certainly, and his domestic initiatives, and he'd have to have been quite a devious character to deliberately falsify a report on the murder of the president. I don't think he did. Okay.
Thank you, Milt.
Thank you.
Yes, we have a question there. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. I really focused on something you said. And you said brought in the spirit of Kennedy. Now, that really illuminated to me. And what I'm seeing now is, I'm sure I have just as many against and could throw cans at me as for, but I see this spirit still in the White House currently. I see a spirit of peace, negotiations. I mean, the Iran has come up, and there's certainly been the industrial a complex of war that has wanted to go ahead and push the buttons all the way along. But I am wondering about the current administration, maybe I'm saying the president, who is really standing back and saying, okay, I've learned from this guy. I've learned from those. And I like that focus. If anything can be said from this, it really touched me. The spirit of what's going on. Yeah, he had a lot of extra stuff going on in his life. Well, who doesn't?
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
let's face it. You know, we all got baggage. Okay, so, but let's look at the spirit. Do we want peace right now, or do we want another war or multi-wars? And I get teary-eyed when I think about that.
When you were saying that, it brought a question up we haven't really discussed, Vietnam.
Yes.
Vietnam. By November 63, Kennedy's domestic program, the Civil Rights Bill, is making progress. The House Judiciary Committee passes it. He's got the Test Ban Treaty signed with the Soviets. Two big achievements. He's really at his peak of popularity and authority and effectiveness as president. That's one of the sad things about his death. It comes just when he's learning the job. It's like Lincoln being shot on the way to Gettysburg, November of his 63. But Vietnam, he didn't have quite figured out. The coup, November 1st, 63, the death of the president and his brother, murdered in cold blood. Kennedy has some complicity in that. Now, when the news comes to the White House, he's shocked. He puts his hand over his face, rushes out of the room. A general sitting there said, what did he expect in a coup? You know, Kennedy doesn't order Diem murdered, certainly, but he did give a back-channel approval of a coup. The big question, what would Kennedy have done in Vietnam? And any of your views are as good as mine on that, because we just don't know. Well, a couple things. He told his aides that if he's elected in 64, re-elected, he was going to really look hard at Vietnam and maybe pull out, even the advisors. He had been to Vietnam as a congressman. He was curious about the world. Foreign policy was his area. And it's not that he had great all-knowing knowledge, nobody does. But in a way, I think Robert Dallek made this point recently, he was cautious. So in Laos, in the Bay of Pigs, in the Berlin Wall, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, he turns away from military solutions. He's been through war. He's seen men die under his command. Now, he wasn't a pacifist, but in the nuclear era, living in the shadow of World War II, he was working hard to prevent a Third World War. He also was very competitive and didn't like to lose. So if the war in Vietnam starts to go badly, he might have done what that good old Yankee senator from Vermont, George Aiken, said, declare victory and pull out and just write it off. Now, there's also evidence that he would have stayed in. In the last weeks of his life, he would give contradictory statements about Vietnam. One person said to me recently, well, he would have done what Johnson did because Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, was Johnson's Secretary of Defense. And the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, was Johnson's Secretary of State. That's true. But Kennedy was the boss. And he was independent. You know, he made his own independent judgments. Lyndon Johnson had great political skills, as we know, in a great society, legislative magician on Capitol Hill. That's where his focus was. That's where his heart was. He wasn't as well traveled as Kennedy. He wasn't as well read as Kennedy. He was not nearly as interested in foreign policy as Kennedy. So, not that he wanders unknowingly to Vietnam, but I think Kennedy would have had a different view than Johnson. Again, we don't know. We don't know. Maybe he would have made the same mistake. Maybe he would have made worse mistakes. So, it's not an answerable question, but it's an interesting one. I just think, when I know about him, he would have been very skeptical of putting 500,000 troops into that country. Two people whose opinion on this question he respected, who told him in person, Douglas MacArthur and Charles de Gaulle, said, whatever you do as president, don't get pulled into a land war in Asia. You can't win it. There are too many, Asians there to fight, and it's just not going to work. And I think he took that advice seriously. It's a really fascinating question, but there's no one answer, but that's what I conclude in my book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I see that spirit going now.
A world history student at Aquinas has a question. Yes, Matt.
I know at the beginning you're talking a lot about the Kennedy family.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there's a lot of myths about where the wealth came from in the family, and I know one of the more popular one is that his father was a bootlegger.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you had some truth to that, or if you believe that it might have came from something else.
It's a good question, of course. What is your name again?
Matt.
Matt. Basically, he was not a bootlegger. But when Prohibition was lifted in 1933, guess who was ready to go and corner the market immediately? He was a tough, hard-nosed businessman. The Kennedys had been in the liquor business in Boston, the liquor trade, when it was legal. But that myth dies hard. There's a new book out about Joe Kennedy, the patriarch, nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. And David Nassau is a writer, the historian who wrote this, and he pretty much demolishes that myth. It's one of those Kennedy myths that does die a hard death, though. But thanks for bringing it up.
Thanks,
Matt.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I was impressed about your outlining the dynamics of the Kennedy family and the power of that family. And what ran through my mind was after Kennedy's assassination, I wondered if you could comment about what the dynamics in the family were, other than the grief and the tragedy, but what influenced Bobby Kennedy to run for president?
Well, I think he clearly saw himself as picking up the standard that was dropped that day. I think there was mixed views within the family. Before he made his decision, once he makes it, they're all committed to it. He runs a very different campaign in '68. In some ways, it's a different political landscape. He appeals very explicitly to African Americans, Hispanic Americans, American Indians, in a way his brother never did or never had to. That, it's a part of the Kennedy myth and legacy and tragedy, and it's, I don't know. Bobby Kennedy was different than his brother. I'm not, some people think he would have been a better president than JFK. I don't know. I mean, I know less about him, certainly, but I think the answer is, after Jack's death, Bobby saw it as his duty, in a way, to head the same thing 12 years later in 1980 against President Carter. Welcome.
Thank you. Our last question will be from Charles Brown.
How does your view of the Kennedy presidency compare with that of Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in his memoir, 1,000 Days?
Okay, thanks, Charles. Good question. Well, Schlesinger had the great advantage of being there in the White House, on the scene. Sometimes he used to write it as the Camelot historian, the court historian. He was there. I mean, he was writing history as he saw it, and he had his biases, but historians who never met JFK have their biases too. So I take Schlesinger's interpretation of Kennedy as a heroic liberal quite seriously. But I think there's other things about Kennedy, the more conservative aspects that Mr. Mitchell mentioned, the tax cut. Schlesinger probably poo-poos a bit as being not as important. We have, the hindsight of 50 years I did in my book. To me, Kennedy's family, his Irish Catholic roots are important and interesting. To Schlesinger, maybe kind of a curiosity. So there is that difference. And also, we know how the story, at least from the moment, turns out. And liberalism in the later 60s, and there's a crisis. The Democratic Party splits in two. So, I have the hindsight of decades that he doesn't have. But I certainly respect his interpretation. I found myself quoting Schlesinger, hopefully not too often. You don't want to do that too much, but great man in his own right. And he was, I in a way envy him. He got to be there, in the moment, in the early 60s in the White House.
Well, very good. Jason, Duncan, thank you very much for
Thanks,
an illuminating talk this evening.
Much. Thanks. Thanks, Liz. That's good.
We're going to just wrap this up.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
I just want to say thank you again. First of all, too seldom do the staff at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies get the nod, the applause that they deserve for helping put events like this together. I want to thank all the members of Grand Valley's Hauenstein Center for helping with this evening. Also, I think I want to emphasize once again how important partnerships are in bringing about events like this. We could not have such wonderful evenings with you without the gracious help of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. It's been a thriving partnership, and we will continue to grow that partnership. And that always brings me back to the man who's central to our mission, the man who knew Jerry Ford, and that's Ralph Hauenstein. Ralph, thank you for your support. I think there's going to be a little article about Ralph in Sunday's newspaper. Watch for it. Finally, Jason has got a Christmas present for you all out here to give to somebody. He's willing to sign books, autograph them. We've got the books out here. It will make a great Christmas present. And let's help him get into the New York Times bestseller list. So, Jason, thank you very much.
Thanks,
this was great.
Oh, great. Good. Thanks a lot. Yeah, it was good. Yeah, it was awesome.
Okay.
Yeah. That's it.